Have you ever been on a date and everything felt amazing? Chemistry, charm, connection, and then suddenly it all goes cold? They vanish. Pull back. You're left overthinking every message you sent. Let me tell you something. That wasn't your imagination. That was likely an avoidant. And if you don't learn how to spot one early, you'll end up in a relationship where love feels like a constant guessing game. They're warm, then cold, fast. And if you've ever dated someone like this, you know exactly how disorienting and addictive it can feel. In the beginning, it feels like a movie. They come in hot with the kind of energy that sweeps you off your feet. The texts are frequent. The compliments are flowing. The chemistry is undeniable. You feel seen, wanted, chosen, and not just on a surface level, but in this soul-stirring, magnetic way that makes you think, finally, this is what I've been waiting for. They know exactly what to say. They're present, attentive. They mirror your energy. You think, wow, they're into this. You feel safe enough to open up, to invest, to allow yourself to finally relax into the beginning of what feels like something real, but then the shift. And it doesn't happen slowly. It happens overnight. The messages become shorter. The replies take longer. The energy is different, colder, more distant. Suddenly, the connection that felt mutual now feels like a one-sided chase. And your brain? It starts spinning. You wonder if you said something wrong, did something wrong, moved too fast, opened up too soon. You obsessively replay your last few conversations. You reread texts, trying to decode the sudden change in tone. And most dangerously, you start blaming yourself for their emotional retreat. What you're experiencing is not confusion. It's not even miscommunication. What you're experiencing is the classic avoidant push-pull pattern. Avoidant individuals are often very good at the initial phase of connection because it feels safe to them at that point. The early stages of dating are filled with novelty, lightness, and low risk. Vulnerability hasn't yet entered the room. They can flirt, be present, show affection, all without feeling trapped. But the moment they sense emotional intimacy starting to deepen, their nervous system gets activated. Intimacy to them is not safety. It's danger. It's a threat to their independence, a cue from their subconscious that they are about to be engulfed, overwhelmed, or smothered. And so, instead of leaning in, they pull away. Not because they've lost interest, but because the very thing they were craving now terrifies them. This warm, then cold behavior creates an emotional roller coaster that's intoxicating. You felt so connected, so seen, and now you're cut off without explanation. That discrepancy triggers your attachment system. It turns a calm interest into an anxious obsession. You start chasing the version of them that showed up in the beginning. You convince yourself that if you just say the right thing, give them enough space, don't come off too needy, they'll come back around. But here's the hard truth. The initial warmth wasn't a lie, but it also wasn't sustainable. It came from a place of excitement, not emotional capacity. And when the relationship threatened to move past the surface, their instincts screamed, retreat. If you don't know what's happening, it's easy to internalize their withdrawal as rejection. You start performing, you adjust your behavior, you hide your needs, you shrink, you start over-functioning, texting more, planning more, giving more, in the hopes of pulling them back into that warm space they created in the beginning. But avoidants aren't reacting to you. They're reacting to intimacy itself. The warmth you experienced, that was them operating within their comfort zone. The coldness that follows, that's their defense mechanism, their way of maintaining emotional control. Here's what makes this dynamic so confusing. After pulling away, they might come back again, just when you've started to detach, just when you've stopped reaching out. They sense the space, and they return with warmth. And so the cycle begins again. The inconsistency keeps you hooked. You think, see, they do care. Maybe I just overreacted. But no. What's happening is trauma bonding. You're being conditioned to crave their approval, to see their inconsistency as normal. and to label their sudden warmth as love instead of what it really is, temporary relief from the fear of closeness. The most dangerous part of this warm then cold pattern is that it feels like love, especially if you grew up in an environment where love was unpredictable. Your nervous system may mistake that emotional chaos for chemistry. You become addicted to the highs of their warmth and desperate to fix the lows of their coldness. But real, secure love doesn't feel like this. It doesn't require chasing. It doesn't feel like guessing. It doesn't punish you for being emotionally available. If someone's affection disappears the moment you start getting close, that's not a sign to try harder. That's a sign to step back and reassess whether this person even has the capacity to hold a healthy connection. Because the truth is, people who are capable of deep love won't go cold on you the moment things get real. They lean in, they communicate, they show up, and they don't weaponize silence when their emotions get triggered. They avoid emotional language, and at first you might not even notice it. It's subtle. It hides behind charm, wit, sarcasm, or intellectualism. You'll be having what feels like a deep conversation, and yet something always feels missing. You open up about something personal, how your day was overwhelming, how something triggered anxiety, how you're feeling vulnerable, and instead of receiving warmth, empathy, or reflection, you get a generic response, a quick subject change, a logical solution, or worse, a blank stare. You're sharing something from the heart, and it's like they're stuck in their head. They might nod. They might even say, "That sucks," or "I get it." But there's no emotional depth to their reply. No reciprocity, no mirroring. Just this sense that your vulnerability has floated into a vacuum and disappeared. And you start to feel it, that cold wall, that unspoken resistance to feeling anything too deeply. What you're running into is one of the core behaviors of emotionally avoidant individuals, the inability or unwillingness to engage in emotional language. They've built an entire identity around staying emotionally safe. Maybe they were raised in an environment where expressing emotion was seen as weakness, or where vulnerability was punished, or where no one ever taught them the vocabulary of emotional life. So now, as adults, when faced with real emotional expression, especially in dating, they shut down. They're fluent in facts, opinions, observations, and plans. But when it comes to saying things like, "I feel scared," "I miss you," "I'm afraid of getting hurt," or even "I care about you," they either freeze or find a way around it. And that's the key. You'll see them constantly avoiding those words, not because they don't feel them, but because to say them would mean facing the emotional intimacy that terrifies them. Instead of emotional expression, you'll hear phrases like, "I'm not good at this stuff," or "I'm just not very emotional." They'll lean heavily on humor or logic to deflect anything that feels too intimate. If you try to talk about your relationship, they'll either downplay it, "Let's not overthink things," or redirect it, "Let's just enjoy the moment." And if you press a little deeper, that's when the emotional walls go up. Suddenly, they get distant, irritable, dismissive, or they physically remove themselves altogether. Anything to avoid a conversation that requires emotional openness. And over time, you start to feel like your emotional needs are a burden. Like maybe you're too much for wanting to talk about how you feel or to ask how they feel. But let me tell you, this is not your flaw. It's not needy to want emotional clarity. It's not clingy to ask for emotional engagement. It's human. What avoidants are doing, whether consciously or not, is creating distance. Language is a powerful connector in relationships. The words we use, the feelings we name, the affirmations we give, they all create emotional safety. But when someone avoids emotional language, they're avoiding connection. They're keeping the relationship on a surface level, and you can feel it. You start censoring yourself. You hesitate to bring things up. You stop sharing the deeper parts of yourself because you know deep down they won't meet you there. And that emotional starvation, it slowly chips away at your self-worth. You find yourself over-explaining simple feelings, justifying your need for clarity, or pretending like you're okay with ambiguity, just to keep the peace. Here's what it looks like in practice. You say, I really enjoyed our time together. I feel really connected to you. And they reply with, yeah, we vibe. Or you say, I miss you. And they respond with a joke, miss me? You just saw me yesterday. Or you try to talk about where things are going and they immediately shut it down. Why do we have to label things? It's not just what they don't say. It's what they won't allow you to say without feeling punished, rejected, or made to feel overly sensitive. And that's the trap. You start lowering your emotional expectations, thinking maybe you're the problem. You start rationalizing their behavior, telling yourself, maybe they just show love differently. But emotional avoidance isn't just a love language. It's a defense mechanism. And until they recognize it, own it, and do the work to change it, you will always be stuck doing the emotional heavy lifting. You will always be the one initiating conversations about feelings, resolving conflicts alone, and creating the emotional glue that keeps the relationship together. And that imbalance will start to wear you down. Because no matter how much effort you put in, a relationship can't thrive when one person avoids emotional language like it's a threat. It keeps intimacy out. It keeps disconnection in. And it leaves you feeling like you're loving someone with your whole heart while they're hiding behind a wall of silence. Their past is a trail of crazy exes. And the first time you hear them talk about it, you might even laugh along. It seems harmless at first, maybe even relatable. We've all had difficult relationships, right? But then you start to notice a pattern. Every ex they talk about was needy, obsessed, too emotional, unstable, or just couldn't handle them. They paint this dramatic picture of always being the one who stayed calm, while the other person was constantly exploding, overreacting, or trying to control them. You don't hear anything about what they might have done wrong. There's no trace of self-reflection, no ownership, just story after story that conveniently casts them as the victim and their exes as villains. And if you're not paying close attention, you'll miss the enormous red flag waving right in front of you. Because someone who constantly blames all their failed relationships on crazy exes isn't just venting, they're revealing their emotional immaturity and their avoidant wiring. This is how avoidants rewrite history. They have a hard time confronting their own behaviors, especially those that contributed to emotional distance, abandonment, or conflict. So instead of doing the work of reflection, they distort the narrative. They make it seem like they were the reasonable one, cool, calm, collected, while their ex was just too much, too clingy, too dramatic, too demanding. But here's the truth. People don't suddenly become emotionally volatile in relationships without context. Most of the time, they were reacting to mixed signals, emotional withdrawal, inconsistency, or stonewalling. And when someone repeatedly describes all their exes in this way, it's not just a reflection on those exes. It's a reflection of how they handled the relationship, or rather, how they didn't handle emotional responsibility. Avoidants are often allergic to accountability when it comes to emotional discomfort. They're uncomfortable with closeness, but instead of communicating that, they withdraw. They leave messages unanswered. They cancel plans last minute. They shut down during conflict. They make their partners feel like they're walking on eggshells. And when the other person naturally becomes anxious, confused, or hurt, the avoidant labels them as crazy. It's a perfect setup. They create the emotional instability by avoiding communication, then blame the other person for reacting to the chaos they caused. That's why the phrase crazy ex should make you pause. It tells you this person may not have done the inner work to process their past, or worse, they don't even see a need to. Another thing to notice is how quickly they offer up those stories. You've only been dating for a few weeks, and yet they're already diving into tales of being mistreated or misunderstood in every past relationship. This isn't vulnerability. This is preemptive image management. They want you to believe that they are the emotionally stable one, and that if anything goes wrong between you, It must be you who became difficult. They plant seeds early, so if and when you begin to have emotional needs or express dissatisfaction, they can subconsciously lump you into that same crazy category. You'll start to wonder if you're overreacting, if maybe you are being too sensitive, if you're headed down the same path as all those other women or men they described, and that self-doubt, that's exactly what keeps you silent. What's even more telling is how little insight they have into the actual why of those past relationships ending. They don't say things like, "We weren't compatible," or "We struggled with communication," or "I realized I wasn't emotionally ready." Instead, they turn it into a one-sided character assassination. And this should scare you, because in any mature, emotionally aware person, you'll hear accountability. Even if their ex was difficult, they'll still acknowledge what they could have done better. They'll take responsibility for their part in the dynamic. But avoidants rarely do this. Their defense mechanism is distance, from their feelings, from others, and from any form of emotional messiness. And that includes their history. Eventually, this pattern turns inward. The longer you stay involved, the more you'll feel the pressure to be not like the others. You'll start to go out of your way to prove that you're cool, low maintenance, unbothered. You'll suppress your own emotions just to avoid being labeled like their exes. You might even find yourself feeling pride in being the exception. But slowly, your emotional needs will start to rise to the surface because you're human. You'll want to talk about the relationship. You'll want to feel connected, seen, and emotionally safe. And the moment you begin expressing that, their defense will kick in. They'll get distant, annoyed. They might even accuse you of changing. And if you're not careful, you'll start believing them. You'll wonder what happened to the ease, the peace, the fun of the early days. But what happened wasn't you changing. It was you simply being real and them being unwilling to meet you there. They crave independence, even in connection. And at first, that can seem incredibly attractive. You're drawn to how self-sufficient they are, how confident they seem navigating life on their own terms. They talk about their passions, their goals, their routines. They don't cling. They don't overwhelm you with constant attention. There's a coolness about them that feels refreshing, even grounding, especially if you've been with someone overly dependent in the past. In the early days of dating, their independence might feel like a green flag, like emotional maturity. But the deeper you go, the more you start to realize this independence doesn't just apply to their lifestyle. It applies to their heart. Their walls aren't just physical, they're emotional. And what felt like freedom in the beginning starts to feel like distance. They want connection, yes, but only on their terms, only in doses, only when it doesn't interfere with their space, their schedule, or their sense of control. And that's when you start to feel like a visitor in their life instead of a partner in it. Avoidantly attached individuals often confuse intimacy with loss of autonomy. To them, emotional closeness feels like a threat, not a reward. It's not that they don't want love, it's that love, in its raw, vulnerable form, demands openness, surrender, dependence. And for someone who has learned to associate those things with pain, neglect, or engulfment, it feels dangerous. So they find ways to protect themselves while still engaging in relationships. They compartmentalize. They keep parts of their world sealed off. They set boundaries that are more about emotional avoidance than mutual respect. They say things like, "I just need space," or "I don't want to lose myself in a relationship," or "I'm not into labels," as a way of reinforcing their safety. And if you push back, even gently, they interpret it as pressure, not partnership. This craving for independence shows up in small, telling ways. You might notice they never quite invite you fully into their life. You know bits and pieces, but you don't feel woven into their world. They may take days to respond to emotional texts, but answer work emails within minutes. They might cancel plans last minute because they need a night to themselves, even if you haven't seen each other in a week. You might go from a weekend of closeness to a full emotional shutdown come Monday morning. And every time you bring up the need for more consistency, more emotional presence, they respond with something that sounds like self-protection, but really masks emotional fear. They'll say, "You're trying to control me," or "I need to do things in my own time," or worse, "This is just how I am." And you'll start to feel like the very act of asking for connection is a violation of their personal space. The confusion comes because they do engage. They do come close. You have moments where it feels like real connection, deep talks, intimacy, laughter, vulnerability. And just when you start to relax into that closeness, they retreat. Not because anything went wrong, but because the closeness itself triggered something deep inside them. Something that says, "This is unsafe. You're losing control. You're getting too close." So they pull back. They become vague, distant, preoccupied, and you're left wondering what you did wrong when all you did was show up with your heart open. If you don't recognize what's happening, you'll start to take their need for independence personally. You'll think you're being too needy, too emotional, too available. You'll begin to adapt. You'll match their distance to protect yourself. You'll hold back how much you reach out, how much you ask for, how much you reveal. And suddenly, you're not in a relationship. You're in a silent negotiation. Both of you dancing around closeness, afraid to disrupt the fragile balance between their need for space and your need for connection. And the worst part? When they do re-engage, when they come back warm and open, it reinforces the cycle. You tell yourself, "See, I just needed to give them space." But what's actually happening is emotional starvation followed by breadcrumbs. And that's not love. That's a pattern built on fear, not intimacy. At the core of this dynamic is the avoidance belief that closeness will cost them their freedom, that being emotionally available will make them lose control, lose identity, or become vulnerable to abandonment. Ironically, they end up creating the very thing they fear, emotional disconnection, by never allowing themselves to fully lean in, and you, the partner, are left in a constant state of emotional limbo. You don't know where you stand. You don't know how to connect without crossing a line. You don't know how to love them without feeling like you're always reaching, always waiting, always afraid that one wrong move will send them running again. They don't make future plans, or they make them, then bail. And in the beginning, it doesn't seem like a big deal. You're just getting to know each other, right? Maybe they're busy. Maybe they've had a lot going on. Maybe they just want to take things slow. You tell yourself all of this because you're giving them the benefit of the doubt. You're being understanding. But as the days turn into weeks and the weeks into months, something starts to feel off. You realize every time you try to talk about something even slightly in the future, next weekend, next month, holidays, birthdays, vacations, they deflect, they joke, they say things like, "Let's just see how it goes," or "I don't like to plan too far ahead." And while that might seem casual or chill on the surface, what it really is a form of avoidance. Avoidants are notorious for avoiding future talk, not because they don't like planning in general, but because long-term conversations threaten their sense of freedom and control. To commit to a plan is to commit to you, and that feels risky to someone who associates closeness with emotional danger. At first, they might even make big, exciting plans: a weekend getaway, a concert, dinner at that fancy place you've both talked about. And you start getting your hopes up, thinking, "Wow, they're really into this." But then something changes. The day gets closer, and they get colder. They become vague. They stop bringing it up. Or they cancel with some last-minute excuse that sounds reasonable enough. Work, exhaustion, an emergency, a sudden need for space. And now you're not only disappointed, you're confused. Because what felt intentional now feels unreliable. What felt like commitment now feels like withdrawal. And you start to wonder, was any of it real? In the moment where it's safe, where nothing is promised and nothing can be held against them later. This can be deeply disorienting for you. You might start feeling like you're the one pushing too hard just by asking if they want to go to a wedding with you next month or book a trip during the holidays. You begin shrinking your own desires for stability and reliability just to avoid scaring them off. You stop asking. You stop suggesting. You tell yourself to just go with the flow. But that doesn't quiet the ache, because deep down, we all want someone who sees a future with us, someone who's not afraid to build something slowly, intentionally, and with care. When someone consistently avoids any conversation that involves looking ahead, it's not just about a lack of interest in scheduling. It's a sign they're emotionally parked in reverse. There's also a very specific moment you need to watch for. When they do make plans with you, but then slowly start to emotionally detach the closer that date gets. In the beginning, the plan excites them. It was probably made during one of those rare moments where they felt safe, connected, and hopeful. But as the commitment approaches, their inner alarm starts to ring. They feel vulnerable, exposed, tied down, and instead of communicating that fear or working through it, they cancel, or they show up, but emotionally distant, checked out, distracted, and you're left trying to salvage the moment, trying to pull them back into the connection you thought you were both building. You might find yourself walking on eggshells, not knowing how to bring it up without them shutting down again. And this cycle, it conditions you to stop looking forward to anything, because hope starts to hurt more than the disappointment. And then there's the gaslighting, subtle but real. When you do bring up the inconsistencies, they act like you're overreacting. They say things like, "Why does everything have to be so serious?" Or, "It's not a big deal, we can do something another time." They invalidate your very normal desire for reliability, and that makes you question yourself. You wonder if you're being too demanding. You wonder if you're rushing things. But the truth is, asking someone to show up for the plans they agreed to is not pressure, it's partnership. And their inability to follow through isn't about your timing or your expectations. It's about their fear. Fear of being expected to commit, fear of being needed, fear of being known in a way that doesn't allow them to hide. And so they cancel, they bail, they stay just close enough to keep you hanging on, but just far enough to keep themselves feeling safe. You feel anxious and start overanalyzing yourself. It doesn't happen all at once. In fact, in the beginning, everything feels exciting. There's chemistry, there's laughter. There are moments of connection that feel like they could lead somewhere real. They give you just enough to pull you in, just enough to keep your hope alive. But then, without warning, their energy shifts. The replies slow down. The warmth fades. The rhythm you thought you had disappears into silence or indifference. And suddenly, you're not even sure where you stand. You go from feeling chosen to feeling uncertain, from connection to confusion. That's when the anxiety starts creeping in, not as a loud, obvious alarm, but as a slow erosion of your peace. You don't just feel uncertain about them, you start questioning you. You overthink every message you send. You write and rewrite simple texts, worrying that you'll come across too eager, too cold, too intense, too casual. You analyze their tone. You wonder why they liked your photo but didn't reply to your message. You wonder if you were too vulnerable, if you shared too soon, if your emotional honesty scared them away. You start tracking patterns, how long it takes them to respond, whether they use emojis, how often they initiate. And with every small inconsistency, your mind spins into overdrive. You're not just wondering what they're doing, you're wondering what you did to create the distance. This self-analysis becomes addictive because it gives you the illusion of control. If you can just figure out what you did wrong, maybe you can fix it. Maybe you can say the right thing to bring them back closer. Maybe if you're more patient, more understanding, less emotional, they'll open up again. But what you're really doing is slowly disconnecting from your own emotional reality. You're ignoring your needs so you can preserve a connection that already feels fragile. And that's exactly what avoidant attachment does to you. It trains you to believe that love must be earned, that connection is conditional, and that your feelings are too heavy to carry in the space they've given you. You stop expressing your needs. You convince yourself that asking for clarity will drive them away. You begin editing your personality, your desires, your emotional language, all in the name of keeping it light or not scaring them off. You begin to tolerate mixed signals and call it patience. You tolerate inconsistency and call it understanding. But deep down, you're not calm. You're anxious, constantly, because your nervous system has picked up on the fact that the person you're dealing with is emotionally unpredictable. One minute, they make you feel adored. The next, they feel unreachable. And that emotional whiplash leaves you in a state of hypervigilance, always scanning for signs of abandonment or rejection. What's even more painful is the internal dialogue this triggers. You begin to wonder if maybe you are too sensitive. Maybe you do have trust issues. Maybe you're just not built for casual dating. Maybe it really is your fault that they seem to be pulling away. And while they may not be explicitly blaming you, the absence of clarity from them creates a vacuum, and you start filling that vacuum with self-doubt. You take their emotional unavailability personally, interpreting it as a reaction to something you lack, and that's where the most damaging part of this dynamic unfolds. Because now, instead of feeling safe in the connection, you feel like you're walking a tightrope, terrified of falling off with one wrong move. You try to be easygoing. You convince yourself that you're okay with the way things are, even when your heart is screaming for more. You pretend not to notice when they go days without checking in. You smile and act unbothered when they suddenly become distant after a night of closeness. But beneath the surface, your anxiety is running wild. You're constantly trying to manage your emotions in private so you don't burden them in public. You're constantly waiting for a signal that it's safe to relax, to let your guard down, to believe in the connection again. But those signals are few and far between. And over time, you become a version of yourself that's always on edge, waiting, hoping, tiptoeing around emotional landmines. What makes this all so insidious is that it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. You're not crying every day or having fights. You're not being yelled at or mistreated in obvious ways. But the psychological toll is just as real, because every time you feel anxious and silence yourself, every time you suppress your need for clarity, every time you abandon your own emotional reality to preserve someone else's comfort, you're reinforcing a dynamic that tells you your needs don't matter. You begin to live in a state of internal conflict, where your heart wants connection, but your mind is working overtime to keep the peace. You're stuck in a cycle of overanalyzing your worth through the lens of someone else's avoidance.